Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Bedlam, 1946. Madness, in all its many forms, has always been a fertile subject for horror films. In particular, the encroachment of its effects by external or internal forces, and the deliberate inducement of these by wicked antagonists upon some poor victim. Another terrifying strand is the examination of institutions that house and treat such souls, studying both the patients and their carers. Classics such as Milos Forman's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975 highlight potentially cruel regimes of abuse by the latter, while Samuel Fuller's 1963 psychological thriller Shock Corridor delves into a common deep-seated fear of being unnecessarily committed, unable to convince the authorities that one is sane enough to ever leave. Val Lewton's final film in his tenure of 9 at RKO, Bedlam, taps into both elements of organizational trauma, as well as touching on the historical progress made in the treatment of mental illness. Bedlam was inspired by London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, also officially known as St. Mary Bethlehem and Bethlehem Hospital, but unofficially labeled Bedlam, and thus forever became negatively associated with a state of frightening mayhem. Originally created in 1247 as a very small shelter for the homeless by a Christian group near the city walls, Bethlem Royal Hospital eventually focused on the care of the mentally ill, albeit unable to retain patients for more than 12 months. The released Bedlamites, as they were called, were reduced to a vulnerable life of licensed beggary on the streets. Such was the lack of attention or resources given to them that until the early 19th century, Bethlem was the only public institution catering very humbly to the mentally ill in the whole of England. Government reforms of conditions at Bethlem took hundreds of years to be undertaken. Meanwhile, Lewton's film takes place in the later Georgian era of 1761, when monstrously corrupt exploitation of the system and its patients was still rife. Not only was the hospital used as a convenient form of incarceration for the authorities' political enemies and private families' difficult relatives, but the public could pay tuppence to grotesquely spectate on the patient's behavior as entertainment. All of this is woven into Boris Karloff's lead role of the hospital's evil apothecary general George Sims, in a script by returning director Mark Robson and Val Lewton, under the pen name of Carlos Keith. A further inspiration strengthening Bedlam's historical accuracy is the final 8th plate depicting the hospital in William Hogarth's famous set of story paintings titled The Rake's Progress, engraved in 1734. The Tate website summarizes the archetypal rake as an impressionable young man from the country who comes to the city after inheriting money and swiftly embarks on a dissolute life, ending in venereal disease, debtor's prison, and death. Having fulfilled his mission, Scene 8 shows the hero-victim Tom at the end of his ride, penniless, stripped of dignity, sanity, and coherence, in the helpless arms of his fiancée Sarah, while a lady aristocrat and her maid, well lit in the rancid gloom, watch his final degradation as callous paying customers. Lewton so admired Hogarth's rich detail that he actually credited him as a co-writer of the screenplay. At its heart, Bedlam focuses on the power struggle between Sims, as the immoral exploiter of his poor charges, and the emerging enlightened conscience of society in the shape of Nell Bowen, initially an unfeeling member of the nobility. As Bowen, Anna Lee was reunited opposite Karloff in a similar good versus evil dynamic to the one they enjoyed in 1936's The Man Who Changed His Mind, which I covered recently. She matches his velvety ferocity with a spirited haughtiness that becomes softened into compassion as part of her character's journey. The script cunningly ensures that Sims is not simply a two-dimensional villain either. Part of this learned man's lust for power derives from self-protection of his sideline as a poet. Like all artists of the time, he needs wealthy patrons to fund him, so he positions Bethlem as a home for his benefactor's unwanted opponents, while allowing him to quietly dispose of competitor talents, as he does indirectly at the start after an escaping one falls to his death from the roof. Karloff deftly glides between horrendous cruelty of the inmates and the oily politicking of his patron Lord Mortimer, a perfectly rotund and genial Billy House, who unsurprisingly went on to play Friar Tuck in Rogues of Sherwood Forest in 1950. Mortimer makes a splendid contrast to Sims, being an open book of plain gluttony and good humour, resembling one of Gilray or Cruikshank's bombastic satirical characters of Little Englander John Bull. To begin with, he even enjoys the self-mockery by Bowen's parrot that he is like a pig. His brain is small, his belly big. Sims invites Mortimer and Bowen to a high society masque performed by the Bedlamites, which neatly demonstrates his bullying humiliation of them and gives an insight into the mood of the times. The period, known as the Age of Reason, for its embrace of a rational perspective on religious freedom, is ridiculed by personifying reason as a gilded boy, Glen Vernon, stuttering his lines through a fatal onset of gold paint asphyxiation, a la Shirley Eaton in Goldfinger. He dies in front of the uncaring Sims and his guests, who represent both the era's dueling Tory and Whig political factions. No more awful denunciation of their combined inhumanity is needed. After Miss Bowen pays a visit to Bedlam, though, instead of amusement, the sight of the Bedlamites causes her revulsion and pity in equal measure, amplified by Sims's hideous voyeurism. Look at the frolic this one treats himself to. She is unexpectedly jolted into a private plan of selfless action for the inmates, along with kindly Quaker stonemason Hannay, Richard Fraser, who had recently endured guerrilla thriller White Pongo, yet more happily appeared with Lee earlier in 1941's celebrated How Green Was My Valley. Hannay becomes the moral compass to guide Bowen through her new landscape of social responsibility. Meanwhile, Mortimer has a more selfish public concern for his self-image and aims to seize her rude parrot, an oddly trivial subplot in such a serious picture. Bowen schemes to hold on to it with the aid of her manservant Varney, Skelton Nags, given more screen time than usual to show off an airy foppishness. Bolstering the cast is the welcome return of Elizabeth Russell, the feline alumnus from the evocative Catwoman films, who's somewhat wasted here, in more ways than one, as Sims's boozy, conniving niece. Together with Mortimer and Sims, the threesome plot to have Bowen committed, and thus remove her and her offending bird from society. From this point, Bedlam dives headlong into the grim waters of conditions inside the hospital. Nicholas Musaraka's camera frames a powerfully unsettling scene of Hannay passing along the row of cells in the dark, accosted by unidentified arms vainly trying to grasp him. A stark image of this in Dennis Gifford's book, A Pictorial History of Horror Movies, haunted me as a boy. Bowen is even forced to ask Hannay for his trowel to defend herself, despite her genuine care for these wretches. Bowen's Committal allows us and her greater insight into the plight of the abandoned, as well as those like herself who were incarcerated for others' expediency. She happily joins in a card game playing with 3 different victim types of some privilege, known as the group around the pillar. Ian Wolfe's disgraced Crown Solicitor Long, whose calm kindness to her offsets a flaring paranoia and raging superiority complex about his fellow professionals, an excitable young man obsessed with dogs, and a silent companion who later reveals he was dispatched there by his family simply to stop his drinking. Knowing of Lewton's wide range of cultural influences, it feels like a deliberate echo of Victorian heroine Florence Nightingale when Bowen's altruistic Lady of the Lamp wanders among the forlorn inmates. Her previously hidden goodness shines out later as well when Sim orders this growing troublemaker to share a cage with a hulking mute. She soothes his frustrated amnesia, while Sims seethes at the scuppered bloodshed he had anticipated. The scene is set for a revolt as the lunatics literally take over the asylum and force Sims to undergo a mock trial, no worse than those which banged up many of them, accompanied by the grisly declaration of Solomon to split him in 2. However, director Robson is careful never to reduce the inmates to crude monsterdom. While the kangaroo court is in session, Bowen's freed cellmate takes a moment during their escape to enjoy the innocent wonderment of the night sky's stars. It is a touching reminder of the terrible loss the prisoners have endured in their hellhole. Sims' sentence is judged to be death by being bricked up alive in the very wall he had attempted to bribe Hannay to build in the film's opening. When the authorities finally arrive and cannot find Sims, Hannay touches the wet mortar knowingly. Bowen is surprised to find she has no need to plead with him to keep quiet. To him, the inmates are not answerable for what they do. And so ends Sims, chiseled, as it were, by a stonemason's equipment and arguably flexible morality. As Bedlam's epilogue card points out, eventual reforms took place in the slow progress toward humanitarian treatment of the mentally afflicted. In the fabricated madhouse of 1940s Hollywood, Val Lewton decided that his time served in elevating B-movies was also enough, and opted to spend his remaining few years devoted to less satisfying A-pictures. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.